What was it really like to wake up as an ordinary Aztec on the day strange bearded men arrived on floating mountains? How did the smell of copal incense mix with the terror of seeing gods that might destroy everything you knew? What did it feel like to watch your entire world crumble, while still having to tend your chai nampas and pay tribute to lords who were just as terrified as you were? Tonight, we're going to explore one of history's most dramatic collisions of civilizations, but not from the perspective of conquistadors or emperors. We're going to experience it through the eyes, ears, and aching backs of ordinary people whose names history forgot, but whose suffering shaped the very foundation of our modern world. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Historical Bedtime Stories. Before we begin tonight's journey back to 1519, I'd love to know where you're checking in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you settling in for the night in London? Perhaps it's already late evening in Sydney, or maybe you're winding down after a long day somewhere in the American Midwest. Wherever you are, I am truly glad you are here. If you truly enjoy these boring history stories that help you drift off to sleep, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to our channel. Your support means everything to our growing community. And speaking of community, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What historical topic would you like us to explore next? Or simply check in and let us know how you're doing tonight. You are such an important part of what makes this channel special, and I thank you for your continued support. Now, as we prepare to step back over 500 years into the sandaled feet of an Aztec commoner, you might want to turn down the lights, maybe put on a fan for some gentle background noise. We're about to embark on a detailed exploration of what daily life was truly like during one of history's most pivotal moments. The daily nightmare of an Aztec commoner in 1519. The morning mist still clings to Lake Texcoco as you wake on your reed mat. The rough fibers scratching against your skin through the thin maguey cloth that serves as your blanket. Your small adobe house, barely large enough for your family of 5, feels even more cramped in the pre-dawn darkness. The walls, made of sun-dried mud bricks, are already showing cracks from the rainy season that ended months ago. And you know that soon you'll need to spend precious time repairing them instead of working your plots. Your wife is already awake beside you, her breathing shallow with the same anxiety that has plagued both of you since the strange reports began filtering in from the coast. Ships like floating houses, men with hair covering their faces, animals. The Kalpuli leader assured everyone these were just exaggerated tales from frightened fishermen. But the knot in your stomach suggests otherwise. The first task of every day is the same: fire. Using a fire drill, you coax sparks from dried grass and wood shavings, your hands already rough and scarred from years of this morning ritual. The process takes longer in the humid air near the lake, and your lungs burn slightly from the smoke that fills your small dwelling before finding its way out through the doorway. There are no windows, just the single opening that serves as both entrance and exit. As the fire catches, your wife begins preparing the morning meal. Atale, a thin gruel made from ground maize, water, and whatever small additions your family can afford. Perhaps a few beans, if the recent harvest from your chai nampas was good. Maybe some small fish caught in the lake. If you were fortunate the day before, the ceramic pot blackened from countless uses. sits precariously on 3 stones over the fire. You've been meaning to replace it since it developed a small crack, but new pottery requires trade goods. Your children wake slowly, the youngest crying softly from hunger. At ages 4, 7, and 12, they represent both your greatest joy and your heaviest burden. The youngest still needs constant care. The middle child helps with simple tasks, but consumes as much food as he produces. And your eldest son is finally becoming useful for real work, but also growing rapidly, and the morning light filtering through your doorway. Your few possessions are arranged around the single room with careful precision born of necessity. Sleeping mats rolled and stacked against one wall. Your digging stick and other tools hanging from wooden pegs driven into the adobe. A few ceramic vessels for storing water and grain. And in the corner, your most precious possessions, the small household shrine. Before you can eat, before you can begin the day's labor, you must make offerings. A few drops of precious chocolate mixed with water, a small portion of the morning's atelier, a stick of copal incense that fills the room with sweet, cloying smoke. You prick your earlobe with a maguey thorn, offering drops of your blood to the gods. This isn't optional. This isn't something you do when you feel like it. This is survival. The gods must be fed, or they will withdraw their protection. And without divine favor, as you step outside, Tenochtitlan is waking up around you, and even in this modest, the city's presence is overwhelming. The sound of grinding corn echoes from dozens of households, as women. Smoke from cooking fires creates a haze that mixes with the morning mist rising from the lake. Dogs bark, children cry, and underneath it all, your plot of farmland lies a short walk from your house, accessible by one of the narrow causeways that connect the various sections of the city. Swanland. You nod to neighbors you've known since childhood, but conversation is brief. Everyone understands that daylight is precious, and the work ahead is demanding. The Chinampas system that feeds your family and the great city is a marvel of engineering that your people have perfected over generations. But working it is back-breaking labor that leaves you exhausted, even before the day. Your plot, roughly 30 feet wide and 300 feet long, rises just above the water level of the lake. The fertile soil, constantly refreshed by lake sediment and organic matter, produces remarkable harvests, but maintaining it requires constant vigilance. You begin by checking the wooden stakes and woven red barriers that prevent your plot from eroding back into the lake. Several have come loose during recent rains, and you spend the first hour of daylight driving them deeper into the muddy bottom. Your feet and lower legs quickly becoming caked with black sediment that smells of rotting. The work requires you to wade into water that reaches your thighs, and despite the warm climate, next comes weeding. A task that must be done by hand since your crops are planted in dense patterns that maximize yield from every square foot of precious soil. You move slowly through rows of maize, beans and squash, pulling weeds and examining each plant for signs of disease or pest damage. Your back aches constantly from bending over. Your hands are stained green from plant juices and scratched from thorns and rough stems. The irrigation channels that run between your raised plots need constant maintenance. Using a wooden paddle, you clear debris and adjust the flow of water to ensure each section of your chinampas receives adequate moisture. The channels also serve as transportation routes for your small canoe. But today, the water level is low, and you'll need to walk rather than paddle. As the sun climbs higher, the heat becomes oppressive. Your cotton loincloth, the only clothing you own besides a single cloak for cold weather, is soon soaked with sweat. There's no shade on the chinampas, no respite from the sun's rays, reflecting off the water that surrounds you. You drink frequently from a gourd container, slightly brackish and filled with particles that crunch between your teeth. By midday, your wife arrives with the children, and your one meal of the day. She carries the food in ceramic bowls, balanced carefully in a woven basket, walking the narrow causeway with the practiced balance of someone who has made this journey thousands of times. The meal is simple but filling. Tortillas, made from corn, you grew yourself. Beans cooked with a few chili peppers, and a small portion of fish caught in the lake, using nets. You eat sitting on the edge of your chinampas, your feet dangling in the water, grateful for the brief respite from labor. Your wife reports the morning's news from the neighborhood. The tribute collectors will arrive soon, demanding the quarterly payment of cotton cloth, cacao beans, and feathers that your family owes to the local lord. She's worried because this season's harvest, while adequate, wasn't exceptional, and meeting the tribute requirements. More troubling are the continued reports from travelers and merchants about the strange visitors from across the eastern waters. The stories are becoming more detailed. Men covered in metal who reflect sunlight like water, animals with 4 legs that are larger than deer, weapons that make sounds like thunder and can kill from great distances. Some say these creatures are gods returning to reclaim their lands. Others whisper that they're demons come to destroy the world. Your 12-year-old son asks questions you cannot answer. Why would gods need to fight with weapons? Why would they ally themselves with enemies of the Aztec Empire? Why do they demand gold and silver instead of the traditional offerings of flowers? You tell him these are questions for priests and nobles, not for farmers, but privately you're just as confused and frightened as he is. The afternoon brings different tasks, but no relief from the physical demands of your life. You spend time harvesting mature ears of corn, carefully selecting which ones to dry for seed and which to eat. Each decision has consequences that will echo through the coming year. Choose wrong, and your family might face hunger before the next harvest. The pressure of these constant calculations weighs on your mind as heavily as the physical labor weighs on your body. You also tend to your small plot of maguey plants, the versatile agave, needles and thread from its thorns, and a mildly alcoholic beverage from its fermented sap. Harvesting maguey fiber is particularly demanding work. You must cut the thick, waxy leaves with a sharp obsidian blade. The process leaves your hands raw and stained, and the sharp points of the leaves inevitably scratch your arms and torso. As evening approaches, you load your canoe with the day's harvest and paddle slowly back. The little boat sits low in the water under the weight of corn, beans, and bundled maguey fibers. You navigate carefully through the network of canals, passing other farmers returning from their own plots. The conversations are subdued, filled with the exhaustion of hard labor and the underlying anxiety that has gripped everyone. Your neighborhood is busier in the evening as people return from work and prepare for the night. Children play games with balls made of rubber and red. Their laughter providing a brief moment of normalcy in increasingly uncertain times. Women gather in small groups to gossip while they prepare masa for tomorrow's tortillas. And men repair tools and discuss the day's work. But underneath the normal rhythms of daily life, there's a tension that everyone feels but nobody directly acknowledges. Messengers arrive more frequently from the capital. Their expressions grim and their conversations conducted in hushed tones with local leaders. Priests perform more elaborate ceremonies, demanding larger offerings and longer periods of ritual fasting. Even the tribute collectors seem nervous, accepting payments quickly and moving on rather than lingering to socialize as they once did. Your evening meal is smaller than the midday portion, consisting primarily of leftover tortillas and whatever vegetables could be spared from the day's harvest. You eat by the light of your cooking fire, the flames casting. Your wife mends a tear in your cloak, using magway thread. As darkness falls, you make your final offerings to the household gods. The ritual is more elaborate in the evening, involving not just food and incense, but also prayers for protection through the night and blessings for the following day's work. You're particularly careful with these evening observances, because the reports from the coast have everyone wondering if the gods are angry about something, if perhaps the strange visitors are a sign of divine displeasure. Your family arranges their sleeping mats on the hard-packed earth floor of your house. There's no furniture, no beds, just the thin red mats that provide minimal cushioning between your body and the ground. You lie awake listening to the sounds of the night. Water lapping against the china, dogs barking in the distance, the occasional call of night birds hunting over the lake. Sleep comes fitfully, interrupted by dreams of floating mountains and metal-covered men. Of your chinampas, withering under the gaze of angry gods, of tribute collectors, when you wake briefly in the deepest part of the night, there's nothing you can say that would comfort either of you. Nothing you can do to change whatever is coming. Tomorrow will bring the same routine of back-breaking labor, the same struggle to extract enough food from your small plot to feed your family and meet your tribute obligations. But tomorrow will also bring you one day closer to whatever catastrophe. You're trapped between the immediate demands of survival and the growing certainty you cannot imagine or control. This is what it means to be an ordinary person, caught in the grinding gears of history. To live in the shadow of events so large that your individual suffering becomes invisible to those who will write the official accounts. You are not a warrior or a priest or a noble. You are simply a person trying to survive. And that, perhaps, makes your story the most important one of all. The mind of Moctezuma, a god king's impossible choices. While ordinary Aztecs struggled with their daily survival, high above the city in the magnificent palace complex, another kind of torment was unfolding. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, whose name meant he who frowns like a lord, sat in chambers that would have seemed like paradise to his subjects, yet found himself trapped in a nightmare far more complex than anything his people could imagine. This is the story of a man who wielded absolute power over millions of people, yet discovered that power meant nothing. Moctezuma had ruled the Aztec Empire for 17 years, When the first reports reached him in 1519, he was a man in his prime, trained from childhood in the arts of war, diplomacy, and divine kingship. His palace in Tenochtitlan was a marvel that would have impressed visitors from any civilization on Earth. Rooms filled with treasures from across Mesoamerica, gardens that recreated every climate in his empire, aviaries containing birds whose feathers were worth more than most people's entire possessions. Yet as Moctezuma received the increasingly disturbing reports from his coastal provinces, the emperor, who commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, found himself paralyzed by uncertainty about visitors whose true nature he could not comprehend. The first messenger had arrived on a day like any other, during the morning ritual where Moctezuma received reports from across his empire. The man, a professional runner, trained to memorize complex information with perfect accuracy, prostrated himself on the polished floor and began his recitation. Strange houses had appeared on the eastern waters. From these floating structures had emerged pale-skinned men with hair covering their faces, wearing what appeared to be silver or metal clothing that reflected sunlight like mirrors. Moctezuma's initial reaction was skepticism. The empire was vast, stretching from coast to coast, and strange reports. Local officials sometimes exaggerated threats to justify requests for additional troops or resources. Coastal peoples were known for their active imaginations and their tendency to see omens and portents, natural phenomena. But as more messengers arrived over the following days and weeks, each bringing consistent details that matched the accounts of others, Moctezuma's skepticism transformed into deep unease. These were not the confused ramblings of frightened fishermen. These were deep, corroborated reports from trained observers who risked their lives to bring accurate information to their emperor. The visitors possessed animals, unlike anything in Mesoamerica. Creatures with 4 legs, larger than deer, that carried men on their backs and could run faster than the swiftest human runners. They had dogs, but dogs larger than jaguars, with terrible fangs and voices that could paralyze enemies. Most troubling of all, they carried weapons that could kill from great distances, weapons that made sounds like thunder and produced smoke like volcanoes. Moctezuma spent sleepless nights in his private chambers, consulting with his council of advisors and searching through ancient codices for any mention of such phenomena. The palace scholars, men who had devoted their lives to studying history, astronomy, offered various theories, but none provided the certainty that the emperor desperately needed. Some suggested these visitors might be traders from distant lands beyond the Eastern Ocean, bringing new technologies and seeking to establish commercial relationships. This was the most comforting interpretation, as it implied the situation could be managed through traditional diplomatic channels. The Aztec Empire had extensive experience dealing with foreign merchants and had established protocols for managing such relationships. Others wondered if these might be representatives of distant empires, perhaps scouting for future military campaigns. This possibility was more troubling, but it was still within the realm of conventional understanding. Empires fought other empires. Armies faced other armies, and victory went to those with superior numbers, better weapons, or more effective strategies. But the most disturbing theory, whispered by priests who spent their days studying religious texts, was that these visitors might be gods returning to reclaim their ancestral lands. Ancient Aztec traditions spoke of light-skinned deities who had once ruled in Mesoamerica, promising to return in times of great change. The god most frequently mentioned in this context was Quetzal, the feathered serpent, a deity associated with learning, wind, and the planet Venus, according to some versions of the traditional stories. Quetzalcoatl had been a ruler who was tricked into leaving his kingdom, but vowed to return. The timing seemed ominous. As 1519, which was associated with Quetzalcoatl's birth, Moctezuma found himself caught between contradictory impulses. As emperor, he was responsible for defending his people and maintaining the stability of the empire. This suggested he should treat the visitors as potential threats and prepare military responses accordingly. But as a religious leader, someone who derived his authority from his connection to the divine realm, he could not ignore the possibility that these visitors were gods whose anger might destroy not just his empire. The emperor's daily routine, once a source of comfort and stability, became a series of increasingly difficult decisions. Each morning, he performed the elaborate rituals required of his divine office, offerings of precious incense, rare flowers, and his own blood drawn with thorns of jade and obsidian. But instead of providing the usual sense of connection with the gods, these rituals now filled him with anxiety about whether he was honoring the right deities, or, inadvertently, his meals, prepared by the finest cooks in the empire and served on golden plates, became tasteless exercises in maintaining appearances. Moctezuma ate automatically, his mind focused on the constant stream of reports and the impossible task. His courtiers noticed that the emperor, once famous for his appreciation of fine food and elaborate ceremony, now seemed distracted and troubled even during the most magnificent feasts. The palace's vast library, containing thousands of codices painted on bark paper, became Moctezuma's refuge as he searched desperately for guidance. He spent hours studying pictographic records of previous encounters, looking for precedents that might guide his decisions. But the ancient texts spoke of conflicts with neighboring tribes and cities, not encounters with beings who might be gods disguised as men. His conversations with advisors grew longer and more frustrating. Military commanders urged immediate preparation for war, arguing that any delay would give potential enemies time to study Aztec defenses and plan more effective attacks. They pointed out that the empire's strength lay in its ability to mobilize vast armies quickly, and that this advantage would be lost if the visitors were allowed to establish secure positions on the coast. Priests counseled caution and recommended elaborate ceremonial responses designed to honor potential divine visitors while still maintaining the dignity. They suggested sending embassies bearing magnificent gifts, offerings that would demonstrate the empire's wealth, and devotion while providing opportunities to learn more about the visitor's true nature and intentions. Diplomatic advisors recommended a middle course, treating the visitors as important foreign dignitaries while carefully gathering intelligence about their capabilities and objectives. This approach would avoid potentially catastrophic mistakes while keeping all options open for future action. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of Moctezuma's situation was his growing isolation from his own people. As emperor, he could not openly express his doubts and fears without undermining confidence in his leadership. The divine king who was supposed to provide certainty and strength for his subjects, himself more confused and frightened than anyone else in the empire, the weight of responsibility became almost unbearable, as Moctezuma realized that his decisions would affect the lives of millions of people. If these visitors were indeed gods, and he responded with hostility, divine wrath. If they were mortal enemies, and he failed to respond with sufficient force, his people would suffer conquest. Sleep became elusive as the emperor lay on his elaborate bed. Should he welcome the visitors as honored guests, or treat them as dangerous invaders? Should he trust in the military might that had built his empire, or in the divine protection that legitimized his rule? As reports continued to arrive describing the visitors' progress along the coast, their meetings with local rulers, and their apparent interest in reaching Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma's time for deliberation. Each day brought the strangers closer to his capital, closer to a confrontation that would determine the fate of his empire and his people. The emperor, who had once seemed to control every aspect of life in Mesoamerica, now found himself buffeted. The man who had been trained from childhood to believe in his divine authority discovered that divine authority meant nothing when faced with divinities whose nature and intentions remained completely mysterious. In his most private moments, Moctezuma wondered if this was how the world would end, not through natural disaster or military defeat, but through a kind of cosmic confusion that would leave everyone, rulers and subjects alike, unable to distinguish between gods and men. The emperor of the most powerful empire in the Americas had become a prisoner of his own palace, trapped by the terrible responsibility of making decisions that could save or damn his entire civilization. The palace gardens, once Moctezuma's favorite retreat, became another source of torment as spring turned toward summer. In 1519, he would walk among the carefully tended flowers and exotic trees, each representing a different region of his vast empire, and find himself wondering if these botanical treasures, the hummingbirds that fed on nectar from rare orchids, seemed oblivious to the approaching crisis, their tiny wings beating with the same rhythm they had maintained for countless generations. A reminder of the natural world's indifference to human political struggles. His relationship with his children, particularly his eldest daughter, who was approaching marriageable age, became complicated by uncertainties about the future. Traditional royal marriages were arranged to strengthen political alliances and ensure dynastic succession. But what meaning did such arrangements have if the dynasty itself might not survive? Moctezuma found himself studying his daughter's face, wondering if she would live to see her children. The emperor's attempts to maintain normal court routines became increasingly hollow performances. The daily audiences where he received petitions from nobles and commoners, the elaborate ceremonies marking religious festivals, the formal dinners where he demonstrated imperial magnificence through displays of rare foods and precious objects. All these traditions continued, but they felt like theatrical productions performed for an audience that might soon disappear. Even his personal hygiene rituals, traditionally elaborate affairs involving specially perfumed waters and oils, became sources of anxiety. As servants bathed him in jade-colored pools and dressed him in feathered robes, worth more, Moctezuma wondered if he was preparing himself for divine judgment or merely decorating a sacrifice. The emperor's dreams, when sleep finally came, were filled with contradictory visions that offered no clarity. Sometimes he saw himself welcoming godlike visitors who brought wisdom and prosperity. Other nights featured nightmares of burning cities, fleeing populations, and the great temple of Tenochtitlan. Most disturbing were the dreams where he could not tell the difference between salvation and destruction, where the same figures appeared as both divine benefactors and terrible conquerors. His consultation with the empire's most skilled diviners and fortune-tellers yielded equally contradictory results. Sacred bones thrown by aged priests produced patterns that could be interpreted as either divine blessing, the flight patterns of birds, traditionally reliable sources of prophetic insight, even the movement of stars and planets, usually clear guides to divine intention, appeared to offer no definitive guidance about proper courses of action. Perhaps most troubling of all was Moctezuma's growing awareness that his paralysis was becoming visible to his courtiers. The emperor, who had once commanded through decisive action and unwavering confidence, now hesitated over minor decisions, repeatedly, about important policies. His closest advisers began exchanging worried glances during council meetings, and palace servants whispered among themselves about their ruler's increasingly erratic behavior. This was the burden of absolute power when faced with absolute uncertainty. The nightmare of a god-king who discovered that even gods could be confused, frightened. The mystery of Malinche, the woman who spoke between worlds. In the swirling chaos of 1519, as the civilizations collided with devastating consequences, one of history's most enigmatic figures emerged from the shadows of slavery to become the most influential person in all of Mesoamerica. Her original name was Malinali, though history would remember her by many others. Malinche Doña Marina, La Chingada. She was a woman whose very existence challenges our understanding of loyalty. The mystery of Malinche begins not with her famous role, but with her earlier life, a story pieced together from fragmentary sources and educated speculation about the experiences of indigenous women in pre-contact, born sometime around 1500 in the region that would later become Tabasco. She entered the world as a member of the Nahua-speaking nobility, daughter of a Kasake, who ruled over prosperous lands along the Gulf Coast. Her childhood would have been one of relative privilege within the complex social hierarchy of Mesoamerican civilization. As the daughter of a local ruler, she would have been educated in the arts considered essential for noble women, weaving complex patterns that told stories, preparing elaborate foods for ceremonial occasions, and most importantly, learning the intricate protocols of diplomacy and trade that bound together the various city-states and empires of the region. But the comfortable world of her early years was shattered by events that remain murky even today. According to some accounts, her father died when she was still young, and her mother remarried another noble who wanted to secure his own son's inheritance. In a decision that would alter the course of history, the young Malinali was sold, officially declared dead by her family to prevent any future claims to her father's lands. The transformation from free noble to enslaved person represents one of the most dramatic social falls. Everything that had defined her identity, her family connections, her social status, her secure position in a known world, she found herself thrust into a brutal existence, where survival depended entirely on her ability to adapt, to please masters whose whims could mean the difference between life and death. Yet it was precisely this traumatic displacement that prepared her for the role she would later play, as she was traded from master to master, moving through different regions and linguistic communities. She acquired something that would prove more valuable than gold or precious stones. She became fluent in multiple languages and intimately familiar with the cultural practices of various Mesoamerican peoples. By the time Spanish ships appeared off the coast in early 1519, Malinali had spent years learning to navigate between different worlds, translating not just words but entire systems of meaning and belief. She understood the subtle differences between various dialects of the complex etiquette that governed interactions between different social classes, and the religious and political frameworks that shaped indigenous thinking about power, legitimacy. When Cortez received her as part of a group of 20 women given to the Spanish by defeated Maya rulers, he initially had no idea that he had acquired perhaps the most strategically valuable person in all of Mesoamerica. The Spanish saw these women primarily as servants and concubines, useful for cooking, cleaning, and providing sexual services to the conquistadors. What they failed to recognize was that they had been given a woman whose linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge. The mystery deepens when we consider the moment of first contact between Malinali and the Spanish. Here was a young woman who had already lost everything once, who had spent years as property to be bought and sold, suddenly confronted with strangers whose appearance and behavior challenged every assumption. The Spanish, with their pale skin, facial hair, metal armor, horses, yet rather than being paralyzed by this encounter with the incomprehensible, within a remarkably short time, she had mastered enough Spanish to serve as an effective translator, not just of words but of concepts and cultural assumptions that neither side could initially understand about the other. Her role as translator placed her at the center of every crucial negotiation, every attempt by either side to understand the other's motivations and capabilities. She became the human bridge across which two civilizations attempted to communicate, and in that position, she wielded influence that would have been unimaginable for a woman of any background in either Spanish. But the mystery of Malinche lies not just in her remarkable linguistic abilities or her rapid adaptation to an impossible situation. The deeper puzzle concerns her motivations and loyalties during the conquest period. Why did she choose to aid the Spanish in their destruction of indigenous civilizations? Was she driven by a desire for revenge against the society that had enslaved her? Did she genuinely believe that Spanish victory would bring benefits to indigenous peoples? Or was she simply making the calculations necessary for survival in an increasingly chaotic and dangerous world? Some historians have portrayed her as a traitor, who betrayed her own people for personal advantage. Others see her as a victim who had little choice but to cooperate with her captors. Still others argue that she was a sophisticated political actor, understood better than anyone else the realities of the changing world and made strategic decisions. The truth probably encompasses elements of all these interpretations, while remaining more complex than any single explanation can capture. Malinche operated in a world where traditional loyalties and identities were dissolving, where survival often required abandoning old allegiances and embracing new ones, where the very concepts of betrayal and loyalty were being redefined by circumstances that no one could have anticipated or prepared for. Her relationship with adds another layer to the mystery. She became not just his translator but his advisor, his cultural guide, and eventually the mother of his son. This relationship was clearly unequal, marked by the power dynamics of conquest and gender hierarchy. Yet it also seems to have involved genuine intellectual collaboration and mutual dependence. Through Malinche, Cortez learnt to understand indigenous political systems. She explained the complex relationships between different city-states, the sources of tension within the Aztec Empire, and the cultural symbols and practices that could be manipulated to Spanish advantage. Without her guidance, the small Spanish force would almost certainly have been destroyed or expelled long before reaching Tenoch. Yet Malinche's influence extended far beyond simple translation and cultural interpretation. She became a diplomatic actor in her own right, negotiating directly with indigenous leaders, proposing strategies for managing complex political situations, and serving as an intermediary between Spanish and indigenous interests, when those interests. The mystery extends to her later life and ultimate fate. After the conquest, she married a Spanish colonist and lived quietly in colonial Mexico. But historical records provide little insight into her thoughts and feelings about the role she had played in the destruction of the world she was born into. Did she feel guilt about her participation in conquest? Pride in her survival and adaptation? Regret about paths not taken? The sources remain tantalizingly silent about the interior life of this remarkable woman. Perhaps the deepest mystery surrounding Malinche concerns the nature of agency and choice during periods of catastrophic historical change. To what extent was she a free agent, making conscious decisions about her own life and the fate of her people? To what extent was she simply responding to forces beyond her control, doing whatever was necessary to survive in a world where all the old rules had been suspended? Her story challenges comfortable assumptions about loyalty, collaboration and resistance, victimization and empowerment. She was simultaneously a slave and a person of enormous influence, a victim of circumstance and an active shaper, a bridge between worlds and a person belonging fully to neither. The woman who spoke between worlds remains one of history's most enigmatic figures. Her motivations and inner life, hidden behind the competing narratives constructed by those who sought to understand or justify the conquest of Mexico. In her silence, she embodies the experience of countless individuals caught in the machinery of historical transformation. People whose names we will never know, but whose choices and adaptations. The archaeological record provides tantalizing glimpses into the world that shaped Malinche's early understanding of power and social hierarchy. Recent excavations in the Gulf Coast region, where she was born, have revealed elaborate burial sites containing jade jewelry, obsidian mirrors, and ceramic vessels painted with scenes of noble life. These artifacts suggest a sophisticated society, where women of high status wielded considerable influence behind the scenes, managing household economies that extended across multiple communities and participating in religious ceremonies. The mystery deepens when we consider the educational system that would have shaped her formative years. Elite Nahua children, both male and female, received instruction in what the Spanish would later call the schools attached to temples, where they learnt not just practical skills, astronomy and historical interpretation. Young noble women studied the intricate art of reading and creating pictographic manuscripts, learning to encode complex narratives in symbols that could preserve information across generations. This educational background helps explain Malinche's remarkable ability to navigate the conceptual challenges. She possessed not just linguistic flexibility, but intellectual frameworks for understanding. When she encountered Spanish legal concepts, Christian theology, and European social hierarchies, She could draw upon sophisticated intellectual traditions to make sense of these foreign systems and find ways to translate between them. Yet the trauma of her enslavement represents a psychological mystery that may never be fully understood. The transition from educated nobility to human property would have required a complete reconstruction of her sense of self and her understanding of how the world operated. She would have been forced to develop survival strategies that involved constant assessment of danger, careful management of her captors' expectations, and the ability to suppress her own desires and preferences in favor of whatever behavior might keep her alive. This psychological flexibility, born of necessity and trauma, may have been what enabled her to adapt so quickly to the arrival of the Spanish, where others saw only incomprehensible strangeness. She may have recognized patterns of dominance and submission that she had learned to navigate during her years of enslavement. The Spanish need for cultural information, their dependence on indigenous knowledge for basic survival, their crude attempts to understand local political systems, all of these weaknesses. The linguistic challenges she faced were extraordinary, even by the standards of professional translators. She was not simply converting words from one language to another, but attempting to bridge conceptual systems that had developed in complete isolation from each other. Spanish concepts of individual property ownership, Christian notions of sin and salvation, European ideas about gender roles and political authority. All of these had to be explained. Similarly, she had to help the Spanish understand indigenous ideas that were equally foreign to European thinking. The complex Mesoamerican understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear. The indigenous concept of rulership as a religious office rather than a political position. The elaborate systems of reciprocal obligation that bound communities together. All of these required creative translation strategies that went far beyond simple linguistic conversion. Her personal relationships during the conquest period remain particularly mysterious. Beyond her well-documented connection, she would have interacted with dozens of other Spanish conquistadors, indigenous allies, enemy warriors, priests from both cultures, and fellow indigenous women in similar positions. Yet the historical record preserves almost no information about these relationships, leaving us to wonder about the friendships, rivalries, alliances, and conflicts. The question of her religious beliefs presents another fascinating puzzle. Born into a world where spiritual and political power were inseparable, she would have been deeply familiar with indigenous religious practices and beliefs. Her later conversion to Christianity, symbolized by her baptism and adoption of the name Marina, raises complex questions about the nature of religious transformation during periods of cultural conquest. Did she genuinely embrace Christian theology, or was her conversion a strategic necessity for survival in the colonial world? How did she reconcile indigenous spiritual traditions with Christian teachings? What did she make of Spanish attempts to demonize indigenous religious practices, while simultaneously relying on indigenous knowledge and labor for their own survival? The Golden Cage, life among the Aztec elite, when paradise became hell. While common farmers struggled with daily survival, and emperors wrestled, another group of Aztecs faced their own unique torment as Spanish conquistadors approached Tenochtitlan. The hereditary nobility whose lives of luxury and privilege suddenly became gilded prisons when their world began to collapse around them. Their story reveals how wealth and status, far from providing protection during times of crisis, can become additional sources of vulnerability. Tlacaelal was a name that carried weight in the halls of Aztec power. Belonging to a man whose grandfather had served as military advisor to 3 emperors, at 35 years old, he lived in a palace compound in the heart of Tenochtitlan that covered several acres and housed not just his immediate family, artisans and retainers whose livelihoods, his daily routine in early 1519 still followed the elaborate patterns established by generations of noble tradition. But now each ceremonial act felt hollow. Each display of wealth seemed precarious. Each exercise of authority carried undertones of desperation. The morning began, as always, with ritual bathing in pools lined with carved stone and fed by springs. Servants, trained from childhood to anticipate his every need, presented him with water, scented with precious flowers. The clothing ritual that followed was an elaborate display of the empire's wealth and the wearer's position, layer upon layer of finely woven cotton, dyed with colors so vivid, featherwork that incorporated plumes from birds found only in the most remote corners of the empire. Each feather positioned according to patterns that told stories about his family's achievements. Jewelry of gold and jade that had been crafted by artisans whose techniques were considered sacred secrets. Yet as servants dressed him in these magnificent garments, Tlacaelal found himself wondering how long such displays would remain possible. The reports from the coast spoke of strangers who valued gold above all other materials, who showed no appreciation for the subtle artistry of featherwork or the spiritual significance of jade. If these visitors truly intended to conquer the empire, would they understand or respect the complex systems of meaning? His breakfast was served in the palace's main courtyard, a space designed to demonstrate both artistic sophistication and administrative efficiency. Hundreds of different dishes, prepared by cooks who specialized in specific types of food preparation, were arranged on low tables according to protocols established by religious tradition and social custom. Chocolate drinks flavored with honey and spices, exotic fruits, brought by runners from distant provinces. But the elaborate meal felt increasingly like a performance, staged for an audience that might soon disappear. Each bite reminded him of the vast network of tribute relationships, trade connections, and political alliances that made such luxury possible. If the empire collapsed, if the tribute system failed, if the provinces rebelled or fell under foreign control, what would happen to the complex web of relationships that sustained noble life? The morning audience, where Tlacaelal received reports from stewards managing his various properties and business interests, revealed the growing strain that uncertainty was placing on the imperial economy. Tribute payments from coastal provinces were arriving irregularly, as local officials diverted resources to deal with the strange visitors. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for generations were being disrupted by rumors. Artisans who depended on steady demand for luxury goods were beginning to worry about their future prospects. His estates, scattered across multiple climate zones to ensure reliable income, were becoming sources of anxiety rather than security. Properties near the coast were directly threatened by the approaching strangers, while inland holdings were experiencing labor shortages as workers fled to more secure locations or were conscripted for emergency military service. The careful diversification strategies that had protected noble families for generations were proving inadequate against threats. The administrative meetings that filled his mid-morning hours highlighted the impossible position. As hereditary officials responsible for managing specific aspects of imperial government, they were expected to maintain normal operations while preparing for emergencies that no one understood. Tax collection, judicial proceedings, religious ceremonies, all the routine business of empire had to continue, even as the fundamental assumptions, tlacalols. Responsibilities included oversight of several the neighborhood organizations that formed the basic administrative units of Aztec society. Under normal circumstances, this involved routine tasks like mediating disputes, organizing collective labor projects, and ensuring that tribute obligations were met promptly. But now these communities were filled with frightened people, asking questions that he could not answer. The palace school where his children received their education became another source of worry, as traditional curricula seemed increasingly irrelevant to the realities they might face. His eldest son, 15 years old, and being prepared for eventual military and administrative responsibilities, was learning the classical arts of noble education, pictographic writing, astronomical calculation, religious interpretation, and diplomatic protocol. But what value would these skills have in a world dominated by strangers who apparently possessed superior military technology? His daughter, 13, an approaching marriageable age, was being trained in the domestic arts considered essential for noble women, sophisticated weaving techniques, ceremonial food preparation, household management, and the subtle social skills needed to navigate court politics. Yet the marriage alliances that would normally determine her future were becoming meaningless, as noble families struggled to assess their own survival prospects, let alone their ability to provide security for daughters and grandchildren. The afternoon brought visits to the great temple complex, where Tlacaloc fulfilled his hereditary obligations as a patron of specific religious ceremonies. The elaborate rituals, involving hundreds of participants and lasting for hours, had once provided comfort and certainty about the cosmic order and the Empire's place within it. Now they felt desperate, like attempts to maintain divine favor through increasingly frantic displays. The priests who conducted these ceremonies were themselves struggling with theological questions. If the strangers were indeed gods, why did they seem to oppose traditional Aztec religious practices? If they were mortals, how could they possess powers that appeared to transcend human limitations? The sacred calendar that governed all important decisions was offering no clear guidance about appropriate responses to unprecedented situations. The palace workshops, where master craftsmen created the luxury goods that defined noble status, featherworkers whose families had served imperial courts for generations found themselves wondering whether their ancient skills would have any value in a world where different aesthetic standards. Goldsmiths who had perfected techniques for creating objects of incredible delicacy and beauty. Precious metals might be valued only for their material worth, rather than their artistic achievement. Evening brought the elaborate social gatherings, arrange marriages, share information, and display wealth and cultural sophistication. But these events were now dominated by anxious speculation about the future, with conversations constantly returning to the latest rumors from the coast, and debates about proper responses to the approaching crisis. the entertainment that had once provided pleasure and relaxation. Poetry recitations, celebrating imperial glory, musical performances featuring complex compositions, dance, presentations that recreated mythological tales and historical events. The artists who performed these works were themselves uncertain about whether would survive whatever transformation was approaching. Tlacalal's private chambers, decorated with the finest examples of Aztec art, and filled with objects that represented the accumulated wealth of his lineage, became a space for contemplating losses that extended far beyond material possessions. The books, painted on bark paper and deer hide, that contained his family's history and the philosophical works that had shaped his education. His personal collection of tribute goods, items sent by subordinate communities as expressions of loyalty, served as daily reminders of relationships that might soon be severed forever. Cacao beans from tropical plantations, cotton textiles from highland weavers, all the diverse products of the empire's vast territory that had once symbolized the interconnectedness and prosperity of Aztec civilization. The servants and retainers whose lives revolved around maintaining his household, these were not just employees but people whose families had served his family for generations, whose children had grown up in his palace, whose entire identity was bound up with their role in maintaining noble lifestyle and dignity. If the noble class collapsed, what would happen to these dependent populations? Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams that mixed memories of past glories, visions of great ceremonies where thousands of people celebrated imperial achievements, blended with nightmares of empty palaces and abandoned temples. The psychological burden of watching a civilization die while being powerless to prevent its destruction was perhaps heavier for those who had the most to lose than for those who had already endured lives of constant struggle. As we reach the end of tonight's exploration into the world of the Aztecs, during their most desperate hour, we've journeyed through the daily experiences of people caught in one of history's most dramatic transformations. From the aching backs and calloused hands of common farmers to the sleepless nights of an emperor paralyzed. From the psychological mysteries of a woman translating between worlds to the gilded anxiety of nobles, we've seen how great historical events are, really, collections of individual human experiences. The collision between Spanish and Aztec civilizations in 1519, but a human catastrophe that touched every level of society in ways that still echo. The farmers we met in our first segment, struggling to maintain their chinampas, while tribute collectors demanded ever more resources, represent the millions of ordinary people whose names history never recorded, but whose suffering provided the foundation for everything that followed. Emperor Moctezuma's paralyzing uncertainty reminds us that even absolute power becomes meaningless when faced with situations. His story shows how the weight of responsibility can become unbearable when traditional sources of guidance, whether political, military, or religious, offer no clear path forward. Malince's enigmatic journey from nobility to slavery illustrates the impossible choices faced by individuals caught between colliding worlds. People who must somehow navigate competing loyalties and contradictory survival strategies while the very concepts of identity and belonging are being redefined around them. And the noble Tlacalal's golden cage demonstrates that privilege and wealth, far from providing protection during times of revolutionary change, can become additional sources of vulnerability as entire ways of life face extinction. These were real people facing real choices, with real consequences. People whose experiences remind us that history is not an abstract process, but a collection of human moments, each one filled with the same kinds of hopes, fears, and moral complexities that we face in our own lives. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Back to 1519. I hope these stories have given you something to think about, and perhaps reminded you that even in our own uncertain times, we are not the first people to face a world that seems to be changing faster than we can understand or control. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you next time for another exploration, complicated and deeply human world of boring history for sleep. Rest well, and remember that you are part of a story that connects you to every person. We are all, in our own ways, translating between worlds.